He oversaw a military disaster so catastrophic that thousands of soldiers died, and he was forced to resign in public disgrace. For most of the following decade, he was politically irrelevant, mocked in Parliament, ignored by his own party, warning about a danger almost nobody wanted to hear about. And then, when Britain needed someone to lead it through its darkest hour, there was only one name anyone trusted. This is Winston Churchill. In 1915, as First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill was one of the key figures behind the Gallipoli campaign, a plan to open a new front against the Ottoman Empire that ended, instead in catastrophic failure, with enormous casualties and no strategic gain. The disaster forced his resignation and sent him from the center of British power to the trenches of the Western Front, serving as a lieutenant colonel in a role far beneath what he'd held just months earlier. That alone would have ended most political careers. But Gallipoli wasn't Churchill's only setback. Through the 1930s, he entered what historians now call his wilderness years, a period of deliberate political isolation, largely because of his outspoken, unpopular opposition to Britain's policy of appeasing Nazi Germany. He was seen by many of his peers as a relic, a warmonger, a man whose best days were clearly behind him. Here's what separates Churchill's response to Gallipoli from how most people respond to a career-defining failure. He didn't disappear, and he didn't spend the following decades defending what had gone wrong. He accepted accountability for the decision, and later leaders and historians have pointed to the disaster as something he genuinely learned from, lessons that would directly shape his more effective decision-making during World War II. This distinction matters. Plenty of people experience public failure and either collapse under the shame of it or spend their remaining energy defending their original decision. Churchill did something harder. He treated the disaster as data about his own judgment, incorporated the lesson, and kept moving. The failure became part of his preparation for the much larger crisis still ahead of him, rather than the end of his story. During the wilderness years, Churchill found himself politically isolated, specifically because he refused to go along with the comfortable consensus that Nazi Germany could be safely appeased. This wasn't a popular stance. It cost him political capital, relationships, and credibility at the time. What's notable is that he didn't soften the position to regain acceptance. He kept making the argument, in Parliament and in print year after year, largely unheeded, right up until events proved him correct in the worst possible way. There's a real distinction between stubbornness for its own sake and conviction, grounded in careful analysis. Churchill's case for taking the Nazi threat seriously was detailed and consistently argued, not just contrarian instinct. When the moment came that Britain needed exactly that clarity, he was the only major political figure who hadn't spent the previous decade being wrong about it. One detail that often gets left out of the great man version of Churchill's story. Friends, hobbies, and interests outside of politics were a genuine source of stability for him. During his lowest professional periods, he painted. He wrote extensively, histories, memoirs, essays on building an entire secondary career as an author during the very years his political relevance was supposedly finished. This matters more than it might seem. When your entire sense of self is tied to one role or one outcome, a setback in that single area can feel like a total collapse. Churchill had built enough of an identity outside politics that a political low point, however painful, wasn't an identity-ending event. That outside stability is part of what let him remain ready, mentally and emotionally intact, for the moment. Britain would eventually need him again. So how do you use any of this outside of wartime Britain? First, after a significant failure, separate the lesson from the shame. Ask specifically what you'd do differently, extract that, and refuse to let the failure become the entire story of your competence. Churchill's Gallipoli disaster became preparation, not a permanent verdict. Second, If you're holding a position you believe is right, but it's unpopular, distinguish between stubbornness and grounded conviction. And if it's the latter, don't automatically soften it just to regain approval. Being wrong in a way that matches the crowd feels safer, but being right when it's unpopular is often what actually matters when the stakes are real. Third, build a life and identity that isn't entirely dependent on your highest stakes. Roles succeeding, interests, relationships, and work outside your main arena aren't a distraction. From resilience for Churchill, they were part of the foundation of it. Churchill's Gallipoli failure and his years of political irrelevance weren't a footnote before the real story of his leadership. They were the training ground for it. The clarity, resilience, and conviction he brought to 1940 were built deliberately during the years almost everyone had written him off. If ideas like this are useful to you, subscribe every week on Ancient Minds. We go inside the minds of history's most powerful thinkers and leaders. See you in the next one. He gave the modern world alternating current, the electricity running through. The walls around you, right now, almost certainly traces back to his work. He held over 300 patents, and he died nearly penniless, alone in a hotel room, feeding injured pigeons through an open window. This is Nikola Tesla, a mind so unusual that even a century later, we're still not entirely sure how to categorize him. Some of this crossed into what we'd now likely recognize as obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and it's worth being honest about that rather than romanticizing it. Uncritically, Tesla was, by multiple contemporary and historical accounts, deeply impractical with money and increasingly driven by compulsions as he aged. But the underlying pattern, extreme, structure protecting long, uninterrupted stretches of focused thought, is one thread of his eccentricity that's genuinely worth separating from the parts that ultimately hurt him.